Welcome to day 8 of our fellowship program. I hope everybody's doing well. John and I are kind of exhausted, but it's been a great exercise so far. The topic today is a conversation with Therese McMillan, who is the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. We're going to learn more about what that commission is and what it does. And Jim Wunderman, President and CEO of the Bay Area Council. And the topic is called, Are Regional Solutions Viable? And just so Jim and Therese, you know that they've had a crash course in government law, are familiar with the constitutional principles surrounding home rule authority and the power of cities and counties to have, certain degrees of autonomy under the California Constitution. And there's a tension there that I know that we're going to get into today. Let me start out by giving you a little bit more background about Therese. Again, she's Executive Director of MTC. She's also she also leads a constituent organization called the Association of Bay Area Governments, which we're going to learn more about today. It's also known as ABAG. Prior to coming to MTC, she was the Chief Planning Officer for the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. She's got tons of experience in transportation and regionalism, 25 years as a member of the commission staff, including 8 years as the Deputy Director for Policy in MTC. And had one stint appointed by President Obama to serve as the Deputy Administrator of the Federal Transit Administration in the U.S. Department of Transportation. So she's got federal experience as well. And Therese, welcome to the program. It's going to be delightful to speak with you today. And John, let me turn it back to you to introduce our good friend, Jim Wunderman.
So Jim, thanks for being here. Jim is first and foremost an old friend of mine and a client of mine for many, many years, wearing many different hats. Not me, him, although me too, actually. I first met Jim when he was deputy mayor. I think they still call them deputy mayors. They might have been chief of staff, I don't know, for Mayor Frank Jordan. And I worked with Jim in Sacramento as well, in the Secretary of State's office during the recall election involving Gray Davis. Jim has a private sector background as well. He's now been president and CEO of the Bay Area Council for quite some time, I think since 2004, and has done an amazing job of building an organization that, was always a meaningful organization, but into a real powerhouse. So 325, they're supported by corporations, 325 corporations, including many law firms. What I find very striking about their work is how much work they've done in the area of regional solutions for housing and transit. Jim has also worked very extensively with the current governor, prior governor, and with Dianne Feinstein. In fact, I guess he worked directly for Dianne Feinstein, as I recall, at some point or another. So in any event, Jim is, I've always thought, one of the most thoughtful leaders in the Bay Area on kind of how do we do the right thing.
So to kick this off then, back to you, Therese. I think if you could provide a little bit of background as to what MTC is and does. If you go onto the website, its complexity just jumps out at you. It's like alphabet soup in terms of ABAG and WIDA and BETA and other organizations that are affiliated or part of MTC. And it obviously it's got a 20 plus, commission of elected officials, very political, very complicated to run that organization, I imagine. give us the sort of the elevator speech background, if you will, on what MTC is and what it does in terms of the Bay Area.
Okay, yeah, happy to. And again, it's a pleasure to be with all of you. As I was telling Art, I've had, as you might imagine, a lot of experience working with my general counsels, and I like to think of them as my best friends very often. So good to see you all in these roles. You know, I'm glad that Art mentioned the alphabet soup, because one of the things I think that is extraordinary about our field, and as we sort of get into this, there's going to be lots of acronyms. I am going to try to not drown you in them, so please stop me if it's difficult, but it's almost endemic in you know the work that we do, that you sort of redound to these alphabet soup, so I apologize in advance. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission has been around for 45 years. It was established in 1970. It has two very official and important designations at the state and federal level. At the federal government level, it is the Metropolitan Planning Organization, or the MPO. You will hear that term. That is important because regionalism has existed in transportation as a federal requirement for decades, right? So, you know, this idea that regionalism might be this floating thing that kind of comes in and out. There's been a recognition that a regional approach to transportation planning and funding has been on books for a long time. And you know, when you think about it, it's sort of obvious. I mean, how many people literally just travel in their one city their entire life? Like almost no one. So this idea of having to operate in a broader landscape for transportation, again, has been around a long, long time. At the state level, we also are the official regional transportation planning agency. It's a very similar, although the demarcations are a bit different between the federal MPOs and the RTPAs in California, but generally they're the same. And again, it's an organization charged largely with the planning and funding of transportation infrastructure. But over time, this has become much bigger, because transportation and land use, and I think this is where we start seeing these tensions. It's always been known that the land use patterns, where people live, where people work, how, where they go to school, drives how you travel between those functions. And so you cannot take and separate transportation and land use when you are talking about planning and when you're talking about investing and operating systems that work for mobility. So with that in mind, most MPOs also have land use planning functions, except in the Bay Area, where for historical reasons we do not have a chance to unpack totally. There's a separate agency for land use, the Association of Bay Area Governments. That organization has been around since 1965. So in the Bay Area, these two functions that, at least certainly at the federal level, were and across the country and mostly in the state of California, are the same agency, is separated in the Bay Area. So that creates immediately an interesting jurisdictional tension and additional layer of complexity that's been tough. So enough of those two basic things, because that'll be important in our discussions on how to make things better. Let's just get a sense, though, of the jurisdictional landscape that these two agencies in partnership cover. 9 different counties, 101 local jurisdictions, 27 separate transit operators, 9 what we call congestion management agencies established in the late 80s by the state legislature, which in almost all cases except for Solano also hold local county sales tax authority responsibilities. There's a number of regional partners in addition to MTC and ABAG. The Bay Area Quality Management District covers basically the same arena and is charged with national and state air quality standards as a regulatory agency, which has huge impacts on both transportation and land use planning, as you might imagine. BCDC, the Bay Conservation Development Commission, which is established to guide development around the San Francisco Bay, so it covers the same 9-county area. There's the California Department of Transportation, which is the State Department of Transportation, massive organization that has regional offices, one of which covers the Bay Area. A slew of federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Transportation, Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration, again, major influence in coordinating all the funding. And MTC, as the MPO, has significant direct funding jurisdiction. U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. Actually, there is a seat on MTC's commission, ex officio, for both the US DOT and HUD, recognizing again this linkage between transportation and land use. And I'm not even going to talk about the water districts, which when you think about the impact that shapes our cities and our landscape, water is a huge influence. And yet that is not even in our direct sphere. MTC itself, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, again, as the MPO, this Metropolitan Planning Organization, has very distinct statutory roles in planning, funding, investment, and the coordination of transportation systems. But to make things more complicated and interesting, it also wears different hats. In the late 1990s, there was statutory change to also make MTC the Bay Area Toll Authority. There are 7 state-owned toll bridges in the Bay Area. Now, we are the Bay Area Toll Authority. We don't own the bridges or directly operate them because that is the role of Caltrans, the State Department of Transportation. However, we control all of the toll revenue, which is a massive amount of funding and leverage. We were also recently designated, literally this year, under new state legislation, as the Bay Area Housing Financing Authority, Funding Authority, to speak to the need for coordinating housing and particularly raising funding for affordable housing. I mean, that just happened in the last legislative session and became in effect beginning of January 1. And then there's a flurry of other things where the Service Authority for Freeways and Expressways, where the Bay Area Infrastructure Financing Authority overseeing expressways. So lots of different hats, but all of that with the goal of trying to coordinate among all of those entities I just said, a cohesive sense of planning, financing, regulating, and operating, in many ways, the transportation system that links all of that. That's public transit, highways, local streets and roads, as well as, to a lesser degree, freight and seaports and airports and the like. So that's the world that I oversee.
and the ferry system as well, right? Under
I'm sorry. And the ferry, yeah. But whole anything that carries you basically, except for a private Google bus. And maybe Jim will be speaking to that. Any public related transportation system falls in some way under the purview of MTC. And I would just say very quickly, and I'll stop, is ABAG, as the Association of Bay Area Governments, has certain land use and housing authorities that right now, interestingly, 2 years ago, There's been talk over literally 40 years about combining our two agencies, because that is what the structure is everywhere else in the state of California. And it's periodically, every 10 years, been beaten back largely by local governments who weren't particularly thrilled about that concept. That said, the two agencies combined the staffs 2 years ago. So now I wear two hats as executive director of MTC and ABAG, because there is one consolidated staff now serving two separate agencies. And so I'll stop there, because otherwise we could go down that rabbit hole.
Right. Well, your job sounds very easy and simple. That's the elevator speech. I'm sure there's some more complexity to it. But let's, before I get to you, Jim, let's stick with Therese here and get into this concept of regionalism. And I, doing a little preparation for this particular session, came across this organization called globalizationofcalifornia.com that had some nasty things to say about regionalism. I'm just going to read from the document that I pulled up. Regionalism destroys the American system of government. Regional government organizations like ABAG are usurping sovereignty and control from our locally elected city, town, and county officials. Did you know that some of your local elected representatives are enabling a shadow government to evolve? These people promote the reinvention of government through their support of and appointments to regional boards that act like Soviet councils. The American political structure is becoming transformed. Regionalism restructures or reinvents the operation of American government by destroying traditional political boundaries, or reinvents and ushers in a transformed system of government that ultimately abolishes private county lines and ushers in ultimately abolishes private property and the rights of the individual. Pretty nasty stuff when you think about it, because the objectives of the organization are obviously well-intentioned, and anybody who lives in the Bay Area has, dealt with traffic and dealt with frustrations dealing with mass transit, et cetera. So let me get your take on this first. I'm going to turn to Jim. I mean, what is regionalism, and how do you react to this apparently, a movement out there that is very, very anti-regionalism?
Yeah. Well, like anything else, it all depends on the lens with which you look through. If you are looking through a lens of regionalism as a government structure and institution, right? That's different than the notion of regionalism as managing outcomes of all of these various functions together. We have been, so my current role largely is viewing regionalism from the point of view of coordinating all of these this unbelievably layered arena of separate governmental institutions to help produce outcomes in the area of, enhanced mobility, of sufficient housing, of protecting our environment, of funding and advocating for, the resources necessary to carry out all of these things. So I always find it ironic that we have these perceptions. I'm being very diplomatic today. I had my coffee. These perceptions of, tearing apart the political structure until those entities want to get from, say, Walnut Creek to San Francisco, and are clamoring for improvements to the BART system to make that happen for them. Or we get these nasty letters about this crushing congestion, God forbid, that everyone's having to live with traveling around the Bay Area. And yet at that point, there's no ownership of that. Oh, well, that's the fault of something else. as opposed to this idea, well, what part of that problem do you, city XYZ, own and are contributing to? Oh, wait a minute, that's a regional issue. So there's a lot of very narrow perspectives, I think, that are there. And my, view is the work that we've been doing is really focusing on producing better outcomes for a region that economically, in terms of equity, in terms of financing, does not operate in these singular little boundaries. There are some things, and I think housing is the arena where we are seeing the most deeply seated parochial, protectionist views, just to throw a word out there, in terms of authorities. But in transportation, you can't look at it the way that was described in that article and even imagine it working. It would just fall apart at the seams at that point. So I'll leave it.
Well, as a longtime East Bay resident, I just, full disclosure, I was strongly opposed to a fourth bore for the Caldecott Tunnel. Because why do I want people from Walnut Creek coming into Berkeley and Oakland?
God forbid they try to get to their jobs there, but there you have it, right?
So Jim, let me turn to you now and ask you, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about the Bay Area Council and what the council does and how it interacts, if it does, with MTC, and then ask you kind of the broad question, if you will, how do you view regionalism, and respond to what Therese just said. So you're still muted.
That better? So, good morning. Thanks for having me, and nice to be with you, Therese, and for you and John. Thanks for inviting me, and I congratulate you on having this program, and for you law students to participate. I think it's important to understand a lot of these issues that you're working on. This issue and others, and John made a nice introduction of me, and he and I do go way back, and worked. One of the most interesting projects John and I worked on during the time I was with, I was Frank Jordan's chief of staff, was we had this big newspaper strike. In those days, there were two newspapers that competed morning and afternoon that were kind of equals, the Examiner and the Chronicle, but they were under a joint powers agreement, and they both went on strike together. And it was a few people died in the protest. It was a 12-day strike, and John and I were the mediators. The mayor, was encouraged to and decided to use the power of his office to mediate this strike, which left San Francisco without news coverage, because in those days you couldn't kind of go to your phone and find out anything. You relied on newspapers. Things have changed a lot. In case you guys don't know what newspapers are, there's things there's big things you open, you can read them, you check, see them around once in a while in the museums. But it was an interesting work we did together, and I learned a lot from John about how to do things like that. And we worked on a lot of labor issues and over the years. He's a great guy and great firm. Myself, I have a public-private sector background that I bring to this job. And so I was in government in San Francisco, two administrations, Mayor Feinstein, and then in the 80s, and Mayor Jordan in the 90s. And then I was general manager of the San Francisco garbage companies, also in Silicon Valley in the waste industry. And then I worked in a Fortune 500 company that was in the financial services business. And I was very involved in a lot of organizations like the Bay Area Council, civic organizations. So I really found the intersection of the public and the private sector to be an interesting place. And the Bay Area Council is a regionalist group by trade, and I'll get into it in a minute, but it was formed for the purpose of regionalism. And the person who had it before me was a woman named Sunny McPeak, who was a classic regionalist, public policy wonk extraordinaire. And she left the job when John and I worked together on that election in 2003. We weren't on one side or the other. We were working for the Secretary of State to carry out an unprecedented statewide election with constitutional implications when there was California's first ever recall of governor. Never been done before. A lawsuit every day or a couple filed to try to block it and so forth. And we were just absolutely in the mix on all of those issues all of the time. And when it was over, Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor, and his first pick for his cabinet was Sonny McPeak, who then left the Bay Area Council on a week's notice. And I had already been with my my previous company for a number of years, and I was involved in the Bay Area Council, and I had become, you know, a regionalist for a number of reasons. When I worked for Mayor Feinstein, you know, she was, as a mayor in those days, somewhat of a regionalist, and she would encourage thinking of San Francisco as a place that's a really important city, but it's part of a regional economy. It's not a thing unto itself. And so when I worked for my previous company, we had offices in different parts of the Bay Area. So I got involved, among other organizations, with the Bay Area Council when the job came open. I was interested in it, and people reached out to me, and I took the job, and I've been there since, as John said, since 2004. So, you know, this organization was created in 1945 at the end of World War II, when the war economy of the Bay Area changed because the war was over, and the leaders of the time, led by Governor Earl Warren, who of course went on to become the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, along with the mayors of the cities and the sort of the leading industrialists from the, you know, what was Standard Oil of California and the Bechtel Corporation and the Kaisers, you know, had a really big role. They formed their own company. The current Kaiser Permanente was formed the same year, formed the Bay Area Council to think about the changes that were taking place in cities like San Francisco, which people perceived to have been built out at that point, and Oakland and Berkeley. Those were the urban areas of the Bay Area in 1945. San Jose only had 45,000 people. There was no Silicon Valley. It was orchards. And you know, most of it was hinterland with a few little, you know, small cities around. So the conception, the reason for the Bay Area Council was to think about things on a regional scale. How do you take an economy that's sort of localized in these cities and make it regional? Where can the people live? How do you balance industry and where people, you know, and homes and agriculture, and open space was even thought about at the time, and so forth. So that was the formation of that. And I don't know if they intended for the organization to stick, but it did. This traced from, and I'll give you a couple of minute history lesson that goes back before that. So there's a regionalist history to the Bay Area that precedes the 1906 earthquake. And it largely stemmed from the late 1800s. New York City annexed Brooklyn and what is now Queens and Staten.
Uh-oh. Got a frozen screen. Maybe Madeline, you could text Jim and
Yeah, I'm on it.
oh, here we go. Looks like you're back.
Am I back?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know where I left off, but basically, New York City in the late 1800s formed New York City in the 5 boroughs, what we see today. And there was tremendous jealousy that came out of San Francisco at the time. So the city tried to annex the rest of what, you know, the goal of the city was a movement called the Committee for Greater San Francisco. And the goal was to get water from Yosemite Park, and because San Francisco had a limited water supply from a private company, and to get public water, and then with that water be able to create a region, a city that was like a region, and have control over that. And so that was a big movement. It was led by the mayor of San Francisco at the time, was a guy named Mayor Phelan, who was a pretty forward-thinking guy and also an avowed racist and sexist, which I guess in those days went over pretty good. Probably wouldn't get elected today. But he tried to put this movement together, but as history would have it, it was blocked by guess who? The Committee for Greater Oakland. So in those days, San Francisco made a lot of fun of Oakland, and Oakland didn't like San Francisco, and so
San Franciscans still make fun of Oakland.
Well, it's better today than it used to be, because now San Francisco's make fun of it, but then they move to Oakland because it's a little bit more affordable than San Francisco. And then when they can't afford Oakland, then they move to where I live and places like that. But that failed back in just before the earthquake, and there were other attempts to kind of create this greater Bay Area region. And the Bay Area Council in 1945 was formed thinking about these kinds of government structures. And in 1960, we led a campaign to combine the Port of San Francisco, the Port of Oakland, the airports, and to actually use bridge toll money. The bridges had been built by this time, to use the bridge toll money to kind of build a common airport port resource. And that measure was defeated in the legislature. And the folks who hated it, getting back to your earlier question, Art, about regionalism, everybody hates regionalism except the regionalists. So, the folks who you mentioned are just extremists in it, and they're good, they're very vocal about it. But people say they like regionalism until, regionalists try to do things which make them uncomfortable and threaten home rule. And at that time in 1960, it was mostly local governments who resisted cities, who resisted this idea of creating this authority. And they then formed something called the Association of Bay Area Governments. So Association of Bay Area Governments, ABAG, was done in reaction to the Bay Area Councils trying to create a regional structure. Flip the clock forward about 30 years. There was a movement that John might remember in the late 1980s called Bay Vision 2020. And Bay Vision 2020, Therese smiles, was the goal of that was to combine what was NTC, ABAG, the Air Quality Management District, and whoever else could be swept up in one regional structure. So take all the regional agencies, put them together, have one common financing mechanism, and give them some real control over regional planning, including the ability to veto local land use decisions. Similarly, this effort, which actually was put into a bill, passed the Assembly, couldn't pass the Senate. I think it didn't lose by much, and was ultimately defeated. And so the two big efforts that the Bay Area Council made on government structure and regionalization, these are big deals when you're telling a place that has a structure that we're going to change that structure and we're going to make it regional. They were both had a lot of traction. They had a lot of following. The chancellor of Berkeley was the chair of the second effort, but they both failed the political test ultimately. Where the Bay Area Council had better fortune was in creating regionalist bodies that were focused on a particular issue. So back in the 1950s, it was a transportation committee of the Bay Area Council said, we need to have a regional transit system, and that was BART. So we created the BART system. It was enacted into law in the late 50s, early 60s. Work began, it led to a vote, which was, it was supposed to be a 9-county system, ended up being a 3-county system, which is kind of the way regionalism can work and the way politics can work, because San Mateo County didn't want it. And it was fought by a developer, a shopping center owner in San Mateo County, who felt that if BART went to San Mateo County, then the people wouldn't shop at Hillsdale Shopping Center. They would come into San Francisco and shop in Union Square. So they got a big campaign in San Mateo and defeated it. And if you couldn't get to San Mateo, you couldn't get to Santa Clara. So what was meant to be it was a big lost opportunity for the Bay Area at that time to create what should have been a 9-county fixed rail system. As it turned out, it was the first heavy gauge fixed rail system built in the United States after World War II. So, to the Bay Area's credit, we were able to do something really big and really important. And there's always the other side: is it wasn't big enough. It wasn't as extensive enough as it should have been. On the ferry system, the Bay Area Council led the effort in the 1990s to create the Water Transportation Authority. And then in 2006 or 7, we created WITA out of what was the Water Transportation Authority, because with a push to bring back ferries to the Bay. Ferries used to be a really big part of the Bay before the bridges were built. 50 million riders a year. That's how people got across the Bay in those days. When the bridges were built, Golden Gate and Bay Bridges were built, a codicil in the bonds required that ferries be eliminated because the bridges charged a toll, and it was the bond buyers wouldn't finance the bridges if there was going to be competition from ferries. So basically all ferries were eliminated back at that time. And it took until the late 70s or 80s when ferries were allowed by law to come back. The Bay Area Council took the initiative in the 90s to create the Water Transportation Authority and later WITA. And I'm chair of that board today, appointed by Governor Newsom. So I'm very involved, if you're interested, Art, in ferries, and spent a lot of time actually. And Therese and I have to be nice to Therese, although I'd be nice to her anyway, because MTC has a lot to say about what happens in the world of ferries. So basically, what you have in the Bay Area Council is an employer association. It's not all private business. A lot of our members are actually enterprise agencies of government, like the Port of Oakland, like SFO, like many of the region's universities. I also teach at UC Davis in the Graduate School of Management, and UC Davis is a member. In fact, all of the universities are members. And typically, what's interesting about the Bay Area Council and sort of unique is that typically it's the CEO of a company or the chancellor of the university who sits on the board. And so we have a pretty kind of highfalutin group of people who bring a lot of resources, a lot of kind of higher level thought, some historically probably some sense of elitism to the world of regionalism. And the mission of the organization, unlike other organizations which are largely sponsored by business that exist to just promote business interests, the Bay Area Council is not like that. And some of our members kind of forget that we're not like that and have to be reminded at times. But for the most part, they join understanding that what we're really trying to do is promote a functional region. And I tell you about the 100-year history and the more modern history only to lay it out that we failed a lot of times to do what folks in the day thought should be done to create a place that would function well for its people, for its businesses, for its institutions. And what we have is a little bit of a mishmash, as Therese said. We're the only region that has both a housing agency or a land use agency and a transportation agency working side by side. And they were very, very separate and competitive historically. They didn't like each other, worked in the same building, and were very guarded. But
they were in the Claremont Hotel. Right,
in the Claremont Hotel originally, and then in the Bort Center that was built in Oakland, and now in downtown San Francisco in South of Market. So I think things have improved a lot, and I think the nature of on the question of regionalism, I think most people would say, if you asked in a poll, should we focus on everything happening at the local level, or should we have a regionalist approach? And I guarantee you, most people would say we should have a regionalist approach. And the variance to that is when someone proposes a housing development, near my house. And even that's gotten better. So, the Bay Area Council was one of the groups that was heavily involved in the forming of the term transit-oriented development. That didn't used to exist. My predecessor, Sonny McPeak, was really big in this. And there were no transit-oriented developments except, things that happened to be there. But now, you can go all around the Bay Area, whether it's on the Caltrain line or whether it's on BART and other transit systems, and you can see complexes, mixed-use developments, apartments that have been built at scale that would have been impossible 20 years ago. So this is a big part of the change that's happening in the Bay Area, and a really necessary part of the change, and something where MTC and the Bay Area Council and other groups are really working together to address the challenges we have in the Bay Area, which are largely related to the regional issues of housing and mobility, transportation, and so forth. And so when you say Therese has a very complex job, you have no idea. This is very challenging on many levels, from how to finance that to how to move through the planning cycles. A lot of different groups have a lot of different interests in how this goes down. There's a really important question that didn't used to be considered. It used to, back in the early part of the century, people talked about sustainability. All of a sudden, and before that, they didn't talk about that. But suddenly the environment really came into play. And our goal was really to fit in with the natural environment. Just as that was gaining momentum, we moved to the question of social equity. How do we address the issues of people of all means, of all colors, of all places in life? And that's become a much bigger issue, and in some ways a more challenging issue.
Let me stop you there, Jim, because
that was the end.
Equity issue. That's a separate topic that is a very important issue, and I'm going to turn to Therese for that to talk about that. But before I get there, I did want to have and Therese, let me move to you. We had talked about this in preparation for the call, where I think MTC was involved with this. I think the City and County of San Francisco was involved with this, but basically telling Brisbane, a small community of around 5,000 people that's south of San Francisco, hey, you've got open space there that we can use for housing, and you should build 4,000 additional housing units. And that became a contentious issue. And as the fellows have learned, under the California Constitution, cities do have autonomy, particularly in the area of land use. They do have home rule authority. And so what do you say to a Brisbane resident who moved there 20 years ago and wanted to live in a unique place that was not particularly dense? And when you have a regional government and other large forces basically telling Brisbane, you have to do this. And they say, well, I don't want to do that. Why would I want to make my community more dense? We like our community the way it is.
Before you answer, Lori Liu, who is an associate with our firm and is the former Brisbane mayor, is on the line. So keep the expletives to a minimum.
Yes, I'm very interested in this answer.
Because as we've there's this tension between, as we say, regionalism versus, hey, I live in this small community. Why do you have the authority to tell me what to do? In fact, under the California Constitution, I don't think you do. Therese, what do you say to that?
Yeah. So, are you referring specifically to RENA and you had cut out? I was talking about Baylands. Baylands, right? But when you were just saying that someone was telling Brisbane to put housing in, was that related to a number assigned to them as from the regional housing needs assessment that is a state requirement?
Yeah, I actually
driver.
Yeah, I'm not even sure. Maybe Lori could chime in, but it was the way it was communicated back to me was Brisbane was effectively being told what to do in terms of, you've got to grant this.
So
you got to let this housing project go forward.
Yeah. So the way it worked, you may recall, was that it was, I think in 2016 or so, there was the draft Plan Bay Area, and it was in the draft that there was the number of housing units that was proposed for Brisbane mirrored the developer's proposal for the Baylands, which was about 4,000 housing units. And I recall there was one meeting of ABAG MTC that I attended along with all of the other council members from Brisbane, where we were voicing our objection to that draft number. So I think that's what Art is referring to. That wasn't the number that may have gotten approved in the final version, but it was at that point a draft document. And so the question is, I think what Art is saying is, what do you tell to a small community? How are they supposed to meet their housing requirements under RENA when they have a small population themselves? And how do you make this plan fit for smaller cities like Brisbane?
The interesting thing, and I think I alluded to it before, really has to get to the point of accountability for everyone who lives and shares an arena. And again, I find it time and time again that people talk about borders when there tends to be a lack of shared accountability to when those borders fail. And in this region, one of, a large part of what my job, and the job, importantly, not just myself as an executive director, but for the local elected officials that sit, importantly, the local elected officials who sit on the commission, the local elected officials who make up the Association of Bay Area Governments, the local elected officials who sit on the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Those local elected officials have to answer to impacts that go beyond their borders. That is at the heart of what regionalism has to grapple with. The problems that the citizenry is facing aren't limited to local jurisdictional borders. That's a fact. And so what we are trying to do is set up a decision-making structure, to set up a response structure where somewhere in all of this, there has to be accountability to the outcomes that are impacting this region, that the region itself acts as an ecosystem, an economic system, a socio-demographic system, a mobility system. It acts as a system that is not limited and fragmented to local jurisdictional borders. That's just what it is. Years ago, when you had a little town on the prairie with nothing around it, maybe things acted, in its own ecosystem little border. But that's not realistically, practically, factually how our region operates. And so the question, for example, with the housing is, well, if jurisdiction X, I'm not going to pick on Brisbane specifically because I think this is endemic across the region. If, the regional housing needs assessment, the way it works is that, because we're in the middle of it right now, the region, the 9-county region, gets a big number that says, this is the housing, looking at, mind you, the number of jobs that are there, the number of housing that are there, and the fact that those are not in balance. If you are going to accommodate your economic ecosystem, people need to have places to live to get to the jobs that are there. It's kind of basic. So when that's not happening, and the result of that is massive soul-crushing congestion because people are actually living in Tracy and in Merced and out in the Central Valley to get to the jobs in Silicon Valley, that's a problem. And so what do you do? The Bay Area collectively, are you going to have some accountability among 101 cities and 9 counties and the like to deal with things that aren't working? And so in that particular case, I think there is not a clear answer, Art, to your question. It really is one about are we all going to mutually accept the things that are not working and try collectively to come to a solution or not? And I think for local governments, it is hard, right? I am not denying that folks would love to build their own little world about which they control. I get that. We all have something. We all want to have our space, which is our house or whatever the thing is. But the point is, there are generations behind us where we are denying them that same opportunity because we're not looking to how they're going to accommodate. I have a daughter who's living with me right now. She's 26. She got her master's degree. There is no way that she can afford to have a house in the Bay Area right now. She can't. I mean, maybe now with COVID, things are beginning to change, but quite frankly, there's an entire generation of people who would love to live in this Bay Area and they can't. And so a question is, who's accountable for the current problems and for the future? That's the larger question that regionalism, in my view, is trying to help facilitate and get to a point of accountability and collective solutions.
It's a very compelling case, particularly when you're talking about housing prices. And the interesting thing that we've been exploring, of course, is, again, there is a California constitutional right that agencies have over what goes on within their borders. And there's some tension there that I think we could go on and on about. But I want to pick up on something that Jim went into concerning equity. And I've heard that term used many, many times. Let me stick with you, Therese, for now, and then we'll go back to Jim. What do we mean by that? When you're saying, I mean, I think you've got a fair amount of your budget devoted to that principle. And explain to us exactly what are we talking about when MTC is talking about promoting equity? Because of course we all like equity, but what does that actually mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can only tell you what, from my perspective and what currently both MTC and ABAG, I've urged them and they have stepped forward in. Equity is defined in a zillion different ways. I mean, for a long, long time, equity was jurisdictional equity. If you generate sales tax money, then you need to get, for example, benefits that exactly equal that. So there was very much in the financial realm, equity was in that, arena. But we are very specifically talking about the inability of everyone to access opportunity, whether it's, mobility opportunity, jobs opportunity, educational opportunity, healthcare opportunity, that there are huge gaps in the ability of communities, and largely people of color and low income communities, who structurally cannot access those opportunities in the same way. And so what we are saying is that in order to advance the San Francisco Bay Area in a way that the people who currently live here or may want to live here can access opportunity in this, with the same, again, access being the key word here, that they have the capacity to be able to access these foundational elements of being able to have a quality of life in the same way, is really the focus of what this is about. We have an equity platform that really speaks to what it would take to get there, defining and measuring where these gaps exist, particularly, just as one example, I'll just tell you, with COVID-19, one of the shocking facts coming out of this is that African American and Latinx communities in the Bay Area are impacted wildly disproportionately in terms of COVID. Why? Because there are structural disparities over decades in terms of access to healthcare and sufficient housing and other things that have made them more vulnerable to a virus that in and of itself does not impact based on race. But the outcome is that these groups are disproportionately suffering and dying from this disease. That's a fact. It's a medical fact. And so unpacking that to say, why does that exist? And how might we rebuild our systemic structures to take away those disparities is really the foundation of the work. I would say importantly, and then I'll stop because I'm very passionate about this and go on for a long time, but equity is not a thing. Equity is not a project, okay? It's not something that you define and then get done. Equity is a objective that cuts across all lines of business and is never finished until all those gaps are gone, which means that it's a lens, it's a way of looking through and prioritizing your work that is critical. So, you know, again, I think for MTC and for ABAG, we are really defining how we're going to put this lens across everything we do, with the objective, again, of first acknowledging and owning that the disparities exist and that we have accountability to help to change that, to bridge those gaps.
Let me turn to Jim to respond to that, because I cut you off when you were began to go into this issue of equity, and I have one question out there is sort of, why is a transportation commission, which is charged with dealing with that, involved in things like housing and equity and social justice? It sort of seems odd that that's in the mission statement, if you will. And so, Jim, if you could respond to what Therese said and add your 2 cents, if you will, and also, why do we have a transportation commission looking at these kinds of issues that would seem to be beyond the scope of their mission?
Well, I just
maybe that's unfair to put that on Jim.
I just want to do it and have fun. Just because, Art, I think it is a really important thing that maybe I didn't qualify. As a transportation commission, a huge part of what causes these disparities is lack of access. If we do not give the same mobility options to West Oakland that we give to Atherton, that's a problem. Because we are creating, directly or indirectly, intentionally or not, we've created a system where people do not have the same access, critical access to services, because you need to travel between them, and yet their options are really different through affordability or physical proximity or whatever the case may be. So I just wanted to say that's the reason why it's so critical, again, that we are involved. So then I'll turn it over.
Did you want me to answer the same thing?
If you could just, if you wouldn't mind responding to what Therese said. It was, very compelling, obviously. And do you have any other insights in terms of how equity can be achieved? I mean, I don't think there's anyone who could say I'm anti-equity.
Yeah, I would just
maybe
say
they're all, I don't know.
when it comes to planning in general, whether it's at a local level or at a regional level, or we're planning for our state, people feel left out, and people are left out, and people who are not the right color or not, don't have the right level of wealth, have a history of being left out of the conversation. And I think that, so this traces to a movement, that has gained some momentum, I think thankfully, and now, now I think is exacerbated, with the murder of George Floyd a few weeks ago. And, now, people are actually talking about race. When we started talking about equity a few years ago, it was pretty good that we started to talk about equity. Nobody would talk about race. It wasn't part of equity. So now people are starting to talk about race. We're starting to get, allowing ourselves to get uncomfortable and deal with issues that, have been issues for a long time in this society, but haven't been properly vetted and properly supported. And, back in the day, big decisions on planning, on where the train station went, on where the road went, those were made by big industrialists, probably some of our members from along and before that. And, then, at one time the folks who created the railroads in California were responsible for controlling the state of California. And then in the early 1900s, people pushed back against that. So, there's been a slow movement towards, enabling, women to vote and to have, to have affirmative action in our schools, which was then taken away, which we might get back. We might see the repeal. I think we're going to see the repeal of Proposition 209. So I think there's a lot of really kind of good things happening that, can't happen too soon. And for groups like ours, it's a little bit uncomfortable because sometimes we really want the transportation agency to just focus on the thing itself. But I think we've kind of gotten beyond that, as an organization, we're thinking, I spend a huge amount of time, me and my staff spend a huge amount of time thinking about how do we reimagine the Bay Area as a place for everybody. And, have we made progress toward equity in the Bay Area? It's arguable that we've gone the wrong direction since we started talking about it. Housing got much more expensive the more people who came. People who were, evicted from their house in Oakland where their family had lived for a couple of generations find themselves living on the outer fringes, paying a really high price for transportation, to get to their job in the inner core. And so, equity is about figuring out how to address issues like that. So I think it's entirely appropriate. And we're just sort of in the beginning of that conversation. And, I think to Therese's credit, MTC is leading the conversations around this. And I think things will be different in the future because, we do have a really inequitable system. Housing, we never got really good at subsidizing housing in the Bay Area. We've dabbled in it. The CASA approach was really about saying, there's just no way we can build housing that's all market rate housing and build enough of it fast enough to impact the pricing so that a person who earns, the median income, forget about, half the median income, can afford to live here. So what you get out of this conundrum we built for ourselves is a increasing homeless population made up largely of people who were raised in the Bay Area and at some point found themselves without an ability to afford a house for one reason or another. That's our homeless population. And so, we've got some pretty big issues to deal with, and they're all interrelated. And it's not realistic to say, that an agency that's responsible for land use or for transportation or for air quality or for conditions on the Bay Conservation Development Commission can ignore these issues, much less a city council or a board of supervisors can ignore these things. I see that as like a big opportunity actually going forward for us because the Bay Area is a forward-thinking place. And ideas can, we're innovative, and I think we'd like to be generous, and I think some good ideas can come to the table. And I know my members, who are largely made up of businesses, are very, very interested to see what kind of ideas we have. And for you, students to think about is, okay, let's get creative about this and figure out how to address these issues at all aspects. Just on one point on regionalism. So one of the things Therese is dealing with currently at MTC is thinking about how the 28 or so, I don't know, it's 28, Therese, transit agencies in the Bay Area interact with each other because largely they have separate fare schedules, they have fare systems, they have separate schedules, and people are frustrated. It's hard to get around the Bay Area to move from one system to another, and so forth. Different, that's something that we're working on in a committee that Therese established to see if we can get to that. But let's think about racism in police departments. How many police departments do we have in the Bay Area? Anybody know? Nobody knows. It's the number's that high. So 28 would be a very small number. Almost every city has one. There's a few cities where they share one. And then you've got, colleges that have their own police department. There's all, special agencies.
Transit agencies, housing authorities. transit agencies, housing authorities, federal government. I mean, my God, it goes on and on. Park
How would
rangers.
it be that, you know, if when we start talking about defunding the police, you know, what's the object of defunding the police? So one could be, well, we don't like the police, so we want to sort of get back at them for being kind of bad actors. But I think a much bigger issue is how do we get resources to deal with some of the issues we'd rather have someone other than the police dealing with, like mental health, or you know, people who have substance abuse issues, or other things that police aren't really trained for. Well, there's a massive overhead. The cost of operating 100-something separate police departments, each with its own chief, who graduates, you know, maybe on the job for a number of years and leaves with a pension in the hundreds of thousands for the rest of life. Many cities in the Bay Area have multiple chiefs. It's also true in fire departments. Multiple chiefs in retirement making how much, John?
Oh, probably on average 250 to 300,000 a piece,
Life, which is getting longer. To the good, people are living longer.
Yeah,
So,
Jim, let me, if I,
as students, you know, and I don't think you've read a single article. Can anyone point to anything that's been written on this subject in all the discussion around policing, and which is front page news every day? Has anybody read about, well, would a regionalist approach help?
let me stop you right there, Jim, because there's a lot to talk about. I did want to allow time for the fellows to ask questions, and we're gonna do that shortly. And also tomorrow, coincidentally, we have Paul Henderson from the Department of Police Accountability, who's going to be our speaker. And this is the topic, which is police reform and what does defunding of the department mean? And actually, you've added to the list of questions that I think we should ask him about, which is, can we look towards a regional solution for policing? That's a really fascinating question. But revealing my own little aspect of NIMBYism, Therese, let me turn to you. And I've been enjoying the post-COVID commute from my place here in Jack London Square to the city, which is about a 12-minute drive now, although it's getting worse. The news today speaks to Carmageddon. That there's going to be people who are nervous about being on public transit, and therefore there's going to be just a massive increase in car usage, and which will cause congestion. Is MTC looking at that? And this will be kind of the last question, then I want to open it up to the fellows, but just curious whether MTC is looking at that issue, and what initiatives can you speak to? What should we expect?
Well, a couple of things. Jim made reference to it, but just to let folks know, the commission established a blue ribbon transit recovery task force that is specifically charged. It's multidisciplinary. It has commissioners, staff, stakeholders, the transit operators, about 30 members, if I'm remembering correctly, to try to tackle this issue of getting transit back after, it really fell off the cliff in terms of riders. Shelter in place basically said no one's out traveling and riding our public transit system. And it's had really incredibly dramatic effects, between 70 to 90% loss of ridership since the shelter in place impact. So post shelter in place, how do we come back? And because it's a public health lens, which is unique in the history of many crises we've dealt with, this notion of what is going to make transit safe is one of the top driving issues that we collectively are working together as part of this Blue Ribbon Task Force. And just really quickly, the transit operators collectively have pulled together a working group looking at, there's many dimensions to it, cleaning, what is the cleaning protocols that need to be attached to vehicles, to stations, to related areas around the system. How do you protect your drivers? How do you protect your riders? How do you accommodate public health directives such as social distancing? And what does that mean in terms of the hugely complicated, but this was an arena where a regional approach is so important, because for people to come back to the system, they need a sense of certainty about baseline health, healthy environment and public transport that they can depend on, that they understand, and that's consistent. So top of mind, I would just note there was a recent article that there is not evidence really that public transit in and of itself is one of these generating clusters. And if you just have to look at Hong Kong, Korea, Seoul, in Asia, where there's lots of people that are on the public transit system and their COVID-19 is going down. So, I think it's really going to be a very cultural shift here in that we're going to have to deal with, which is going to play as much into the rebound of public transport as any of the technical and health generated issues.
So thank you for that. And got about 15 minutes left. And so at this point, there's more questions I could ask, but I wanted to talk about CASA and SB 50 and that whole initiative, which is a fascinating initiative. And I think I would just encourage the fellows, if you haven't read the CASA Compact, you could go onto the MTC website and read it. It's a really innovative proposal. But Madeline Klein is our question administrator. So let me turn it over to you, Madeline, to see if anybody's got hands up, and then we can turn it over to the fellows for questions.
Hi, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I just want to start by saying, like, as someone who's lived in the Bay Area, we're all, I grew up, my grocery store is in Berkeley. I walk my dog in Albany. I work or now go to school in San Francisco, but I live in Oakland. So I think we all live these regional lives. But my question goes to accountability, which Teresa was speaking about, and sort of the personal accountability and the accountability of municipal governments. And it made me just think about, if you're an elected official, you feel accountable to your constituents. And if you're and I think if you're a constituent, you feel like your elected officials are the ones who are accountable to you. They're the ones that you can go to a city council meeting and yell at. And can you imagine a regional system where there was more people felt that the regional system was more accountable to individuals, and then maybe where the municipalities then could it would build out? Because I just think our political structure is how it's sort of built. The accountability doesn't go out far enough, and how to get creative in the future, how the political structure could maybe look differently, can change.
And Jake, if I could just add to your question, because I think you've really hit this nail on its head, that the local elected officials, you're absolutely right. Like when I was on the city council in Brisbane, I felt accountable to my constituents, and they were kind of shouting in my ear, local control, local control. Yet the message I was getting from the region, from MTC and ABAG, was regionalism. We need to be accountable collectively. So this tension was very difficult to manage, and I would love to hear more also about, what ideas they have for, empowering local officials, in communicating with their constituents on how to message this regionalism message, and at the same time make their constituents feel like they have local control and are part of this regional solution, and finding that balance. I think it's a really tough question.
Well, I'll try to take a shot at it, because again, I don't think there is an answer. I can only give you some perspectives based on my long history and experience and working in all different circumstances. Local control is a very interesting concept, because there's no, what is the scale of local? Okay, Brisbane has, I'm not sure how many, you know, what the population is, but it's pretty small compared to where I worked before, which was the city of Los Angeles. Okay, the city, okay, in that case, local is hugely different. LA has 7 million people. And so the city council of Los Angeles, Mayor Garcetti of LA, had to be accountable to those citizens whose the scale of the city would equal a region in any other aspect. So I think we also need to some degree, also separate out the effect from the input. It's my view is that elected officials, no matter who they are, need to be, I do agree that they need to be accountable to individuals that maybe live there because voices need to be heard. Although I would say with equity, that access to voice has not been equal. So let's start with that as one of the core accountabilities. Are you, in fact, as a local elected official, really ensuring that that voice can be equally heard? So I'll just put that out there. But secondly, there's this notion of being accountable to your constituents' needs, and those needs often are not located just within your boundary. Transportation being absolutely the epitome of that. So I think when you really unpack what being accountable to local constituencies means, it's much more layered and complicated than just, I'm only going to, you know, answer to the needs of one individual, and because what they want often is far beyond your capacity as a local elected official to even respond to. So I think it's a matter of, in my view, it starts with giving voice, an equal voice, and then realistically saying, defining the problem, and then building the collective response to solve the problem. And our political structures today, I don't think are nimble enough often to accommodate that kind of problem definition and problem solution. And I think that's where, you know, I'm not a political scientist, so I might be getting into realms that are different, but I see that really as the core of how we collectively define problems and collectively solve them. And what does that look like? What governing structure, not government, but governing structure helps you do that? That's what I see as the challenge that we all face going forward.
Yeah, if I could just add in, you know, I agree with what Therese said, but, you know, I'll take it a step further, and, you know, I guess I'll apologize to Lori in advance. And, you know, I have respect for the cities and the people who run for office and want to lead and be involved in their community. I think the Bay Area suffers from a terrific design flaw. We have, you know, Therese led off and said we have 101 cities and 9 counties in a relatively small geographic area. That's a huge mistake. It was a mistake we made. You know, I keep coming back to history today. I usually don't talk about history, but you know, along the way, we created these cities for various reasons. A lot of them were created by real estate developers who wanted to build what they wanted to build and couldn't build it under the county authority. So they created a city in order so that they could build their thing. And it hasn't worked well, and it's not a functional model. And you know, one writer, a guy named Joe Matthews, some of you may have read recently, suggested, why don't we get rid of the cities, and we have 58 counties in California, just make the counties the cities, and we'll have 58 cities instead of 440 something. It's just as bad down in Southern California. It's probably worse. So, you know, I think that it's not a good way to address issues. I said earlier, you know, 28 transit agencies. It's clunky to have that many transit agencies to manage that kind of a institution. And when it comes to our region, and we have a bay in the middle of all of these, which make moving about an added challenge when folks have differing opinions about what we want on our freeway, what San Mateo thinks they should have on their 101 freeway versus what Santa Clara thinks they should have on their 101 freeway, what San Francisco thinks about their 101 freeway, when for crying out loud, it's the same freeway that transports people. They really should be a common denominator as to how we make decisions about things. And, you know, to me, at best, local government should have a voice. So we'd like to hear your opinion about what you think in your community, because communities should have influence. But at the end of the day, you need a decision-making capacity that enables good decisions to be made. We're 45 years in the hole, 45 years of building too little housing in the Bay Area, 45 years because local government has been rejecting housing proposals because there's home rule and because people show up at the council meeting and say, you know, I don't want this in my neighborhood. I don't want this to get built. And it's up to the council. They ultimately control land use. So, you know, it has failed us and we should fix it. It's hard to do.
Michael.
Great. Thank you both for speaking with us this morning. To an extent, Jim just touched on this, but regionalism sort of, it looks different in different places, not just because of population data, but also because of topography and features of the landscape. And I was wondering if you could offer your insights on how the Bay Area's unique topography presents you both with challenges today in your respective positions.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because one of the things that's also been recently, and again, not enough time, but this notion of the mega region. I mean, we haven't even been able to get our arms around what the region is, but then there's this significant discussion happening about the mega region of the Bay Area, which basically pulls directly in large swaths of the Central Valley, because that's where people are living and they're working, in the central area. I mean, anyone driven 580 during rush hour? Totally crazy. It's like the most congested, maybe 80 exceeds it, but 580 morning and afternoon is just astonishingly crushing because of the commute traffic coming from the Central Valley. And so in many ways, again, I spoke to that ecosystem that has spilled over. It's bleeding over if you look at jobs, housing relationships far beyond the boundaries of the 9 Bay Area counties now. And so we're and it's sort of a geographic thing. In some ways, for a long time, the ridges, the Bay itself has created challenges, particularly in transportation, because we have this body of water that creates these natural breaks in terms of travel patterns, bridges and the ferries and BART, going under the tube. We're trying to basically manage travel demand that is greatly affected by what the geography dictates in terms of solutions. And then you've got this weird thing that's it's gone over the mountains, right? And it's also now, over the Altamont Pass and into the Central Valley. So planners love this, geographers love this, because it, really gets to some practical, again, facts that you need to work with. But it does create, very interesting regional boundary situations. Like, what is an air? Like, we have actually different air districts in our region because of how pollutants are concentrated. So yeah, I think it just becomes a really important element that frames, again, problem definition and problem solution. It's not a constraint as much as I think a framing that even today simply keeps changing.
Yeah, I would say that when we conceived the region, I said back in 1945, you pretty much had 3 urban areas, San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley. The rest was hinterland. As we built it, we allowed it to build, we didn't plan it. And it was built as a single family home region. And so now you've got, the region feels like it's built out. And the solution, I don't think topography, topography I think plays a role, and certainly the Bay is a major factor. It's also one of the major points of attraction of the place. It is the major point of attraction And the Bay Area is named after it, rightly so. But we're a region that lacks density, and we've resisted density. And once you build a community of single family homes, it's hard to convince the people who own a single family home to allow density in their community. But it's not appropriate, we wouldn't build it this way today, given what we know. It's a misappropriation of land. It's not fair to the environment to do what we did. And then requiring pretty much, it's hard to plan for transportation when, everybody needs their car in order to, go to the store. So I think what we really need to do, and I think we are doing, and it's taking time to do, is convince folks that density is not a threat in their community. We can increase population and provide for folks without having to go into the Central Valley. The reason people move to the Central Valley and why we need to plan for it in a mega region is de facto, hundreds of thousands of people are commuting every day into the Bay Area. They're not selecting to live in out there because they prefer it. It's because it's affordable. And so if we want to make the Bay Area affordable, we need to increase supply. And as lawyers, you should be asking questions about, maybe in some of the other sessions, about regulations. Ask folks, what does it actually take to build housing in the Bay Area? Why is it $800,000 to build a unit of housing in the Bay Area, to build it? And you'll get some interesting answers from folks in the know about that.
Well, thank you, Jim. We've got time, I think, for one more question. And I believe Peter has his hand up, so he will have the last question.
Yeah, only if no one else wants to go. Thank you both so much for coming as well. And this is more probably aimed at Therese, but since you have this great experience in the Bay Area and LA, and actually this builds off Jim's question, I want to ask about the cost of constructing public transportation. So we've talked a lot about the need to densify and how much public transportation supports that. But, the Bay Area and LA both have these $900 million per mile construction costs for new transit, which is 2 to 3 to 4 times what it costs to build in Paris or other similar cities. And so I was wondering what you think have been the kind of drivers of that. What are the problems and how should we go about addressing? It's almost nothing compared to housing is how much it costs to build transit.
I'm going to leave that one to Therese because I'm sorry, but I have a 12 o'clock with my board, so I've got to run. So she's more knowledgeable about this, but it's a really good question. And I want to thank you guys for having me aboard, and Therese, it's always fun to have these kind of opportunities with you. Take care.
Jim, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Good luck. Good luck.
Well, super quick. There are so many factors that are attached to that. Some of the ones that are often lifted up are, regulatory frameworks that are attached to these major construction projects. I remember taking a trip with my mom about 10 years ago in China, and just seeing, it was like shocking how quickly, like literally infrastructure being built under your feet, right, as they're doing it. And noting that, well, there's a centralized national government and there's really no environmental regulations that are attached that need to be, put into place. So we have elected as a country, as a nation, to, among other things, make environmental protection a paramount objective of what we would like to do. And so just as one example, in order to ensure that that happens, there are certain requirements that would be attached to any particular, piece of infrastructure, public transit or regardless, that would need to be adhered to in order to ensure that, safety protection. So there's a whole regulatory framework that has a cost because we value the things we're trying to protect. And so that's one thing. Then there's just, for the Bay Area and LA in particular, it is a lot more expensive. Cost of labor, just, the economic structures of the labor industry, much more expensive on the coasts than it is in the central part of the state. So there's those sort of practical sort of economic drivers that I don't even pretend to fully understand. There is the fact that, as we were talking about voices, there's a lot of people often that don't want a project to happen. And so there's a lot of mixed, unlike other countries that basically say this project is going to happen, it's going to happen now, and oh well. Here, there's a lot of debate and approvals and governmental structures and the back and forth that goes into deciding whether the project's going to happen at all, which means the timeline are decades of delivering, and every year that you don't build it, the cost of doing that goes up. So there's many, many, many reasons why it's expensive. I believe that there are definitely ways for streamlining that process, but it really also gets down to, how does the decision-making structure around these projects, how is that set up? And we, again, in the Bay Area and California, I would say in many respects, have a very complicated decision-making structure that's attached to the delivery of these projects. And how much people are willing to alter that becomes a really interesting question. So that's a very high level and just some random perspectives, but it's something that we struggle with because the cost of, we never have enough money to do everything that needs to be done. We just don't. And so if we can't wrangle those costs down in some way, we're going to be increasingly limited as to the level of infrastructure that's possible to deliver. So it's a really important question you posed.
Well, we are now out of time. We could have gone on for a lot longer, I think. And Therese McMillan, I can't thank you enough for participating in our program. It was a great conversation, and I wish you the best of luck.